From the very beginning, there was something unusual about Margaret's life, something her children never fully understood. She was warm, caring, and fiercely protective of her family, but behind her kind smile, there was always an unspoken shadow in her eyes. Her daughter, Emily, often wondered why her mother would stare at old photographs for hours, or why she sometimes sat quietly by the window at night, whispering to herself as though she were carrying on a conversation with someone who wasn't there. The story begins on a rainy evening in late autumn, when Margaret, now 72 years old, was admitted to the hospital after collapsing in her home. Her health had been declining for months, but she insisted that it was just the natural way of things. Emily and her younger brother Daniel rushed to her bedside, terrified that this could be the moment they had long dreaded. As doctors moved around them, checking monitors and whispering in low voices, Margaret reached out with trembling hands and held her children close. She told them she had something important to share, something she had carried for more than 50 years. But before she could reveal it, the nurses interrupted, ushering the family out as they tended to her. That night, Emily lay awake in the hospital chair, her heart pounding with unease. What could their mother possibly have hidden all these years? Emily and Daniel had always believed they knew everything about their mother. She grew up in a small town, married their father young, and built a quiet life devoted to raising them. Their father, Richard, had died years earlier, and Margaret never remarried. She rarely spoke of her own childhood, and when asked about her parents, she would change the subject quickly. It was a family mystery they had learned not to push too hard, until now. The next morning, Margaret's condition worsened. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her breathing shallow. Emily leaned close, begging her to hold on. At last, Margaret opened her eyes, glassy and filled with tears, and whispered. "There's something you must know. About me. About your father." The words struck Emily like lightning. About their father. What could she mean? Daniel pressed for answers, but their mother coughed violently, unable to speak more. The doctors said her time was slipping away, and they should prepare themselves. Yet Margaret refused to let go until she had unburdened her secret. Later that afternoon, when the room was quiet, Margaret beckoned her children closer. Her voice was weak but determined. "You've lived your whole lives believing one story, but the truth is different. I loved you too much to tell you before. But now, I cannot leave without you knowing." Emily and Daniel exchanged anxious glances. Margaret continued. "Your father, Richard, he wasn't the man you thought he was. He wasn't your father at all." The silence was deafening. Emily's heart raced, her throat dry. Daniel stammered. What do you mean?" "He raised us." "He?" Margaret shook her head slowly, her eyes welling with tears. "Yes, he raised you. He loved you as his own. But by blood, you are not his children." Emily's world spun. Everything she thought she knew about her family was crumbling before her eyes. She demanded an explanation, her voice trembling with both fear and anger. Margaret began to tell her story, her words pulling her children into a past they had never known. In the summer of 1969, Margaret had been a young woman living in the city, full of dreams but burdened with struggles. She had fallen deeply in love with a man named Thomas, a passionate and ambitious artist. Their romance was intense, full of secret meetings, promises of forever, and whispers of a life they planned to build together. But Thomas carried secrets of his own, dark ones. He came from a family with powerful enemies, and his involvement in things he should have stayed away from put both of their lives in danger. One evening, Margaret received a letter from Thomas, warning her that he had to disappear for his safety, and hers. He swore he loved her, but he could not stay. Days later, she discovered she was pregnant. Alone, scared, and ashamed in a society that judged women harshly, Margaret confided in no one. It was then that Richard entered her life. A kind and steady man from her hometown, Richard had always admired her. When he learned of her situation, he offered marriage, not out of pity, but out of love. He promised to raise the child as his own, to shield her from the cruelty of gossip, and to give them both a stable home. Overwhelmed with gratitude, Margaret agreed. Together they built a quiet life, and soon Daniel was born, followed by Emily 2 years later. Margaret paused, struggling for breath as tears streamed down her face. "I wanted to tell you, but every time I looked at you, I knew Richard had been more of a father than Thomas ever could have been. He gave you everything, and I couldn't take that away from his memory." Emily and Daniel sat frozen, trying to process the revelation. Emily's mind replayed every childhood memory, suddenly colored with doubt. Her father's gentle smile, his words of encouragement, his sacrifices, they all remained real, but now carried a new, painful weight. Daniel asked the question that burned in both their hearts. So, who is Thomas? Where is he now? Margaret closed her eyes, whispering, I never saw him again. But I kept something that belongs to you. With trembling hands, she motioned toward the drawer in her bedside table. Emily opened it and found an old wooden box, worn with age. Inside lay faded letters tied with a ribbon, and a small photograph of a man with piercing eyes, Thomas. That night, as Margaret slept, Emily sat reading the letters. They were filled with passion, fear, and promises Thomas never fulfilled. In one, he spoke of watching from afar to keep Margaret safe. In another, he mentioned something cryptic. If anything happens to me, look for the house by the lake. The truth will be waiting. Emily's curiosity grew into an obsession. She needed to know whether Thomas had truly vanished, or if there was more to his story. When Margaret finally passed away 2 days later, Emily and Daniel were devastated. Yet amidst their grief, the weight of her confession pressed heavily on them. They decided to follow the trail Thomas had left behind. Weeks later, Emily and Daniel traveled to the lake mentioned in the letter. Hidden among overgrown trees, they found a dilapidated cabin. Inside, dust covered every surface, but on the desk lay an old journal wrapped in cloth. It belonged to Thomas. The entries revealed shocking truths. Thomas had indeed been hunted by dangerous men, but he never stopped watching Margaret and the children from a distance. He wrote about seeing Emily's first steps, Daniel's first day at school, moments they never knew he had witnessed. He had lived in the shadows, protecting them, even as Richard raised them openly. In one heartbreaking entry, Thomas wrote, "They will never know I exist. That is the price I pay for their safety. But one day, perhaps they will understand how much I love them." Emily closed the journal, tears blurring her vision. For the first time, she understood the depth of sacrifice both men had made, the man who left to protect them, and the man who stayed to give them a family. The story ends with Emily standing by her mother's grave, holding both the letters and Thomas's journal. She whispered softly, "You both loved us in your own way. And because of that, we were never without a father." It was then she realized that her mother's secret was not a betrayal, but an act of love. Margaret had carried the burden of 2 men's sacrifices, protecting her children from a truth that might have torn them apart too soon. Only at the end did she set them free with the knowledge of who they truly were. And though Emily and Daniel's world had changed forever, one thing remained unshaken, the love of a mother who gave them everything, even her deepest secret, at her very last breath.